everyone, and welcome to Kingdom Plantae. Well, there is a lot that you should know about Kingdom Plantae, even when all your compound is green and you know you have interacted, you have eaten, you have destroyed, and you have been under many trees. You have enjoyed a lot of beauty. Most of us admire taking photos near flowers, or sitting under a big tree, or just sitting to admire the nature made up of trees. Well, I know this is very interesting kingdom, and we really interact with it. So we are going to look at this kingdom. By the end of it all, we shall have covered most of what we need to know about Kingdom Plantae. What do you think are plants? Well, everyone would say the green matter around us, most of the green things around are plants. Well, you might be right. In fact, you're very closer to what plants are. Because what makes the green nature around us are plants. But well, there's much more that we need to know about what plants are. And for that reason, we shall now look at the characteristics of plants. What makes them to be called plants? So one is, when you analyze their cell walls, you realize that the cell walls contain cellulose. Yes, that is one of the distinguishing characteristics of plant cells, and plants in general, that they contain cellulose cell walls that makes their cells very rigid and hard. And you remember this in your cytology when we looked at plant cells and animal cells, where cell walls are typical of plant cells. The other one is, of course, there are those that reproduce sexually, but we also have those that reproduce asexually, as we are going to expound more later on. All plants are multicellular, meaning they are made up of many cells. Unlike the bacteria and the protists we have been looking at, that are made up of just one cell, plants in this case are made up of many cells. Plants are photosynthetic. Most of the plants carry out photosynthesis, meaning they have chlorophyll, the green pigment that traps sunlight, and they are able to fix the atmospheric carbon from carbon dioxide into organic compounds to be used by even other animals and other organisms. But there are also some plants that do not have chlorophyll. Now, how would those ones survive? Well, some of them are parasitic. So they parasitize other plants or even other organisms. So at least by now, at A level, we can now appreciate. At O level, it was difficult for us to introduce that there are some plants that don't carry out photosynthesis. It would be difficult for the student to comprehend that fact. But at least now at this level, we can agree that there are some plants that do not carry out photosynthesis, though they are very few. And we are going to mention about them later on. Plants have alternation of generations. That is to say, the haploid and the diploid generations alternate in life cycles. And we're going to see very soon from, for example, the life cycle of the moss, where the gametophyte is dominant and is haploid, and then the sporophyte is diploid, and they alternate in the life cycle of the plant. So we'll be able to see how that happens. Well, having looked at some of the characteristics of plants, allow me move to the different phyla in the plant kingdom. There can be called divisions or phyla. Phylum is a common name, and many are phyla, but for plants particularly, we can even call them division. That is okay. So we have the first one, the first division or the first phylum, Bryophyta. You can pronounce with me, Bryophyta. Well, and those organisms that belong to that phylum are called bryophytes. They are called what? Bryophytes. And they majorly include the mosses and the liverworts. I know you must have heard about the moss plant or the liverworts. These two members are the popular members of Phylum Bryophyta. And what is peculiar with them is that they live in moist areas or in damp areas, areas that have water often, and usually under the shades or on the walls of the cold parts of the wall where there are shades and waterlogging. You'll easily find some green things there growing, and those ones most probably might be the mosses or the liverworts. They are the smallest land plants. So what you see there are very many trees, very many small plants, the mosses, and they form the whole forest there. But before we have a look at them, let's see their characteristics. One is that they do not have the vascular tissues. The xylem, the phloem, and other tissues are missing in these organisms. And of course, that's why they cannot grow bigger, because definitely without vascular tissues, they cannot be supported up. It will be difficult to transport materials. So they don't have vascular tissues. They also don't have true roots and true stems or even true leaves, but they have structures which resemble roots. They are called rhizoids. Then they have some structures like stems or leaves, as we shall see. And then when you look at their general body, it is called the thallus, and it has leaves and stems, some simple leaf-like structures or stem-like structures. Well, they are called, the body part is called the thallus, the main body. And then what is important, what you should not forget, is that there is alternation of generations, where the gametophyte generation is the dominant generation, and then the sporophyte grows on top of the gametophyte. And we are going to look at that in the life cycle of the moss. The gametophyte is anchored by the thallus or rhizoids, which grow from the stem, as we shall see shortly in the structure. Water and mineral salts are absorbed by the whole plant surface because the plant surface lacks the cuticle. Therefore, water uptake may occur by osmosis. Remember, in higher plants, they have the cuticle, and that cuticle repels water. It prevents water absorption. But in these plants, the cuticle is not there. They don't have cuticle in their surfaces. The body surface is permeable to water. So when it rains, they can easily absorb water just from anywhere in the plant. So members, this Phylum Bryophyta contains two main classes. And the first class is Hepaticae. We can pronounce together Hepaticae, and that is the liverworts. And then we have class Muci. Members, class Muci, and those are the mosses. So we have two major classes in Phylum Bryophyta: class Hepaticae, the liverworts, and then class Muci, the mosses. So we can look at the mosses there, and I know now you can recognize these fellows very well. So you can see the different mosses there. So having looked at them, an assignment is please look for them now where you are staying. Collect them and look at them properly. Go and get them and then observe and see more about them. So that's how they look. They grow on walls, under the shades, on the stones, yes, and damp areas that are cold. And then the liverworts look like that. In case you come across this one as well, you can remove a piece and even preserve it. So that's how the liverworts look. So those two members, the mosses and the liverworts, all belong to Phylum Bryophyta. So those are the plants we are looking at. Members, those are plants. What you are seeing there is a phylum of kingdom Plantae. Those ones are also plants. However, they are primitive plants. They are called primitive plants because they lack most of what other plants have. They don't have. So they are called primitive what? Plants. But they are also plants because they share some of the characteristics. So let's the moss, and we look at its structure there. So when you look at the moss, it has two generations, or you could say two parts, but better to say two generations: the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. And the sporophyte this consists of the capsule and the stalk there, as you can see, and that capsule it contains spores inside it. It's actually the spore capsule. Then we have the gametophyte, which contains the stem-like structure and the leaf structure. And then we have the roots there, the root-like structures called the rhizoids. Remember, these plants are very small, and for you to be able to see that, you must scan under a microscope. That's when you can see them clearly like that. They are so small. So comparing the two classes, class Hepatitis C, the liverworts, and class Musi, the mosses, you find out that they have quite similar parts there. They both have the sporophyte generation, which depends on the gametophyte. Have you seen the sporophyte generation there? That upper part there. The seta and the capsule, which is attached and grows and depends on the gametophyte down. So that's how they look like. We are going to see their life cycle shortly. And welcome to alternation of generations. So we are going to look at this term. I don't know whether you have ever heard about it. What is alternation of generations? So members, this is the occurrence of two or more generations within the life cycle of an organism. So when you have a life cycle of an organism and more than two or more generations occur, we call that one alternation of what? Generations. For example, in these plants, a haploid gametophyte generation alternates with a diploid sporophyte generation in the life cycle of the same plant. So that kind of mechanism is what we call alternation of generations, is where a haploid gametophyte generation alternates with a diploid sporophyte generation, the life cycle of the moss for this case. And we are going to look at the life cycle of the moss much more in detail here. So members, I want you to observe that clearly and see, then we explain together. So a moss or a moss plant consists of two distinct forms in its life cycle. It consists of two distinct forms in its life cycle. The haploid gametophyte, which is dominant, and a diploid sporophyte. Haploid means it has one set of chromosomes, and then diploid means it has two sets of chromosomes. Remember this in reproduction. Haploid, one set of chromosomes. Diploid, two sets of what? Chromosomes. And we're going to see how that happens. So in this life cycle, what is important for you to note, even if you are to forget other things, is that in this life cycle, in the alternation of generations here, we have two generations or two distinct forms. We have the gametophyte, which is haploid, it is N, single N, and then we have the sporophyte, which is diploid, 2N. And then we have the antheridia, which is the sperm producing organ, and then the archegonia, which is the egg producing organ. I want you to look at in that life cycle. Have you seen the Antheridia and Archegonia. Antheridia and Archegonia. Yes, Antheridium and then the Archegonium. Many are Antheridia, one is Antheridium, and many are Antheridia. And then Archegonium, one, Archegonia, many. Have you seen them? They exist there. So, what happens is that when mature, the Antheridia will shed the sperms, or the antherozoids. So, Antheridia produces the sperms when it is mature. It releases the sperms. So, what happens? The sperms have the flagella and they can swim to the Archegonia. The Archegonia produces the ova or the egg. So, Antheridia is the sperm, and then Archegonia produces the egg. So what happens in the middle? When it rains, the sperms can swim from the Antheridia to the Archegonia. Sometimes the Antheridia and Archegonia are found on the same plant, but in most cases, this fertilization takes place in different plants. Archegonia from one plant and Antheridia from another plant. So the sperm swims from the Antheridium to the Archegonium, from one plant to the other. And this is aided by water. So when it rains is when this happens much more prominently. When it rains, one drop of water can cover over 10 plants because these plants are too small. So just one drop is enough. So what happens is that after swimming, after the sperm has swum from Antheridium to the Archegonium, fertilization will take place and they will fuse to form an embryo or the zygote, which in this case will be diploid because the sperm is haploid and the egg is haploid. When they fuse, they form a diploid sporophyte, as you can see from there. After fertilization, you will have a diploid what? Sporophyte. Now that diploid sporophyte will remain on the plant bearing the Archegonium and will begin growing from that plant, from gametophyte. It will grow into the seta and the sporangium. And then that part there, the seta and the sporangium, will be the sporophyte. So the sporophyte grows on top of the gametophyte. Members, the sporophyte grows on top of the gametophyte. And when it matures, the sporangium will burst and release spores, which are haploid. Yes? Will release spores that are haploid. That means meiosis has taken place in the sporophyte. For the sporophyte to produce haploid gametophyte, for the sporophyte to produce haploid spores, it means meiosis has taken place in the sporophyte. So after meiosis, the spores will be released, and those spores will, if the conditions are favorable, they will germinate into the protonema, which will eventually become the gametophyte, and then the cycle repeats itself. That's why it is called the life cycle. We can again re-echo from here so that we understand it better. We have two generations in the life cycle of the moss. We have the sporophyte generation and the gametophyte generation. In the moss plant, the gametophyte generation is the dominant generation. Dominant means it's the one which supports the other generation. And the sporophyte is diploid, the gametophyte is haploid. So let's start from where meiosis is. Meiosis takes place from the sporophyte generation, and the spores are released. The sporophyte generation produces spores. So when the spores are produced, when conditions are favorable, these spores will germinate or will grow into the protonema. Those are young gametophytes. Eventually they will grow up and become gametophytes. Others, yes, some, of course not all spores germinate, but some of them will germinate and they will become the gametophyte. We shall have many plants, and in the gametophyte there will be female and male parts. The female part is called the archegonium, and the male is called the antheridia. The archegonium is the female and the male is the antheridia. So when they mature, the antheridia will release the sperms. Antheridia releases the sperms, and these sperms, when it rains, there will be water available to allow the sperms to swim from the antheridium to the archegonium, and then there fertilization will take place. The sperm from the antheridia or antheridium will fuse with the egg from the archegonia, and then they form a zygote. So antheridia and archegonia may be from the same plant or even from different plants. But because these plants are all together, fertilization can still take place from one plant to the other. So after fusion, the zygote is formed, and that zygote remains in the gametophyte. It starts growing from the archegonium of the female gametophyte. It sticks there and begins growing, becoming a sporophyte. Are we getting that one? So the sporophyte will begin growing, and it is still attached to the gametophyte. And then when it matures, the sporophyte will undergo meiosis and will produce spores that are haploid, and those spores will again be dispersed, and then the cycle repeats itself. So members, I want you to summarize the cycle, the alternation of generations of the moss. What I have just described is the life cycle of the moss, or alternation of generations in the moss. So in this case, you are seeing that in the same plant we are alternating from the diploid sporophyte to the haploid gametophyte. Diploid sporophyte, haploid gametophyte. So that's why we call it alternation of what? Generations in the same plant. So we have already explained it. Great. Okay, I know you have picked the life cycle of the moss, and also we know what moss plants are, and the liverworts, and the phylum they belong to. Which phylum do they belong to? Phylum Bryophyta. Great. So I want to move to another phylum, and that is phylum Pteridophyta. I want you to pronounce with me phylum Pteridophyta, sometimes called phylum Filicinophyte. And the members of this phylum are majorly ferns. Those plants are called the ferns. You remember the Dryopteris filissimus and the Pteridium. Those are some of the members, the species in this phylum. So those are the ferns, in case you have never seen them. In mosses, you find these ferns are growing together with the mosses. After mosses grow, they also support the growth of the ferns after some time. You remember the succession story in ecology. After mosses, these are pioneer species, the mosses, then ferns will follow, and then higher plants will grow later. So these are the ferns, and they are of different types. I don't know which one is near where you stay. You could pick and then have a look at them, and then compare them with the mosses that we have just looked at. Are they the same, or they bear the differences? Well, those are the ferns. Others can be found on big trees, others are on the walls, under the trees, and so on, but usually in cold and moist areas. So what are the characteristics of these fellows? Let's look at the characteristics. They have the xylem and the phloem, meaning they have vascular tissues. That is why they are slightly bigger than the mosses. They have vascular tissues, the xylem and the phloem, the transport tissues. And then the leaves are relatively larger, and those leaves are called the fronds. The large surface area of the leaves increases the photosynthetic surface of the plant. Of course, The bigger the leaves, the larger the surface over which light could be trapped, and therefore photosynthesis can take place. And then the spores are produced in the sporangia. One is called the sporangium. Usually they are in the clusters called the sori or the sori. One is the sorus. These sori are usually found behind the fronds, the leaf-like structures. That's where you can find them. You find brown dots, and those are the sori in a mature fern. That's when you can find them. Also, alternation of generation occurs, but in this case, the sporophyte is the dominant stage. Remember, in the mosses, the gametophyte was dominant, and the sporophyte was growing on top of the gametophyte. But in the ferns, the sporophyte is the dominant stage, and this applies to most of the higher plants as well. The sporophyte generation is the dominant generation. The gametophyte is reduced to a small, simple structure, heart-shaped structure called the prothallus, that we shall see. Then the sporophyte generation possesses true roots, stems, and leaves. You can see from here that at least it has some structures which resemble higher plants. The roots penetrate the soil to absorb water and dissolved mineral salts. So the structure of the fern looks like that. From the bottom, you have the roots, and that rooting part is the rhizome. It is used for anchorage. Then we have the stalk there, or the stipe, and then we have the leaf blade, the blade there. Then the stalk and the blade is called the frond. Many are fronds. So you can look at those parts there and appreciate them. Is it similar to what you... Yeah, probably yes. And you can now see the parts. So when you pick it, you can look at those parts and try to name them. Try to observe them, try to learn more about them, and then you can be able to appreciate what we are talking about now. Yes, let's stick to the moss structure there still. Much more clearer. See, the whole of that part is called the frond, and the frond includes the blade and the stipe. And then down on the ground you have the rhizome, and then from which the roots develop from. Great. So those are the parts. Okay. Thank you. So let's look at the life cycle of the fern, or alternation of generations in the ferns. Now remember, in this case, the sporophyte is the dominant generation, and the gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte, or the gametophyte is reduced and even disappears at one time. So a fern consists of two distinct forms in its life cycle: the diploid sporophyte, which is the dominant stage, and the haploid gametophyte. I want you to remember that very clearly, that in the fern there are two distinct forms in the life cycle: diploid sporophyte and haploid gametophyte. Remember, the sporophyte produces spores. Gametophyte produces gametes, the sperm and the ova, the eggs. Sporophyte, spores. Gametophyte, gametes. Okay. The diploid spore or mother cell, the spore mother cell inside the sporangia, will divide at one point when they are mature, and when it is protecting covering shrinks, it will spread, or it will catapult the spores and pours them, releases them so that they can be dispersed. The spores will germinate into a heart-shaped prothallus, which is a gametophyte. So after the spores have been catapulted or have been dispersed, they will land on the surface when the conditions are favorable, they will germinate into a prothallus. Now this prothallus bears the male and the female. Remember, it is now the gametophyte, and we say gametophyte produces gametes. So the prothallus is the gametophyte. So it bears the antheridia, which produces the haploid sperms, and then the archegonia, which produces the eggs by mitosis. Is that clear, members? And then on rupturing, the ciliated sperms from the antheridia will swim towards the fertile eggs in the archegonia. So when the antheridia is mature, it will rupture, releasing the sperms which have cilia. Remember, in the moss, the sperms have flagella. Now here the sperms have cilia. So they will swim using the cilia via the water until they reach the archegonia where the egg is, and then they will fertilize it. Then the zygote will develop and will grow into the sporophyte. So in summary, we have two generations, a diploid generation and a haploid generation. The diploid sporophyte and a haploid gametophyte. So let's start from where meiosis is. Where meiosis is. So meiosis takes place in the sporophyte. Producing of the spores takes place by meiosis. So after spores have been produced, they will be released and they will land on the surface. If the conditions are favorable, the spores will germinate, will grow into the prothallus, a heart-shaped structure there you are seeing, the prothallus. And that prothallus there will grow, will increase in size, although not so big, but it will grow, increase in size, and it will bear the antheridia and the archegonia. It will bear the male gamete producing organ called antheridia, and a female gamete producing organ called the archegonia. They will be there. Now, when the antheridia is mature, it will rupture, it will break, releasing very many sperms that bear cilia. You know, cilia are used for locomotion. So when there is water, splash of water, or when it rains, the sperms will swim from antheridia to the archegonia, where they will fertilize the egg. And so when fertilization takes place there, members, when fertilization takes place, a zygote will be formed, and that one will develop into a sporophyte. But the sporophyte will still be attached on the prothallus. It will begin growing from the archegonia itself, where fertilization has taken place. The sporophyte will start germinating from there when it is still attached on the prothallus. But eventually, it will grow into a bigger or mature sporophyte, and the prothallus may disappear even at one time. It will disappear, and the sporophyte, on the underside of the sporophyte, the sori will develop, and those sori are the spore-producing parts. One is called sorus, and many are sori. They will produce spores by meiosis, and those spores will be dispersed, and the cycle continues. The cycle continues. So that's why it's called a life cycle. It does not end. It is continuous like that. So thank you very much. You can even see from there. I want to ask you to explain now that one. Are you seeing the sorus number 1? Yes. From sorus, sporangium, spores. From sporangium there are spores that have been produced. Spores will germinate into the gametophyte called the prothallus. The gametophyte bears the antheridia and archegonia. The antheridia produces sperms, archegonia produces the eggs, and then the sperms will one time fuse with the egg. They will move by cilia to the eggs and fertilize and remain there, and then they will together develop into an embryo, and that embryo will develop into a sporophyte. and the sporophyte will grow and begin producing spores. And the cycle continues. So I hope you can be able to describe the life cycle of the fern and also the one for the moss. Great. Let's compare the two plants, the fern and the moss. What have you seen similar in these two plants we have looked at, the mosses and the ferns? I have seen that both of them form spores. Is that true? Yes. And both of them grow in damp soils or in moist areas? Yes. Alternation of generation occurs in both of them. Is it true? Yes. Where we have alternation between a diploid sporophyte and a haploid gametophyte. It takes place in both of them. And then in both, the gametophyte is anchored by the rhizoids. That's true. What about the differences? The differences between the fern and the moss? The moss have no vascular tissue. That's what we said. They don't have vascular tissue. The xylem and the phloem are absent. What about the moss? The fern? The fern has vascular tissues. The moss, no thallus. The thallus that produces the spores is not there in the moss, but it is found in the fern. The moss, spore capsule is present. In the fern, no spore capsule present. Then in the moss, the sporophyte, that word is supposed to be sporophyte. The A is not there. It's not saprophyte. It's sporophyte. The sporophyte is attached to the gametophyte. In the moss, remember the gametophyte is dominant. So the sporophyte just attaches itself on the gametophyte. Then in the fern, the gametophyte is attached to the sporophyte. And then in the moss lacks true roots, leaves, and stems, but the fern has true roots, stems, and leaves. In the moss, there are no rhizoids, and then in the fern, they are there. And then the rest of the differences are there as well. You can look at them and master them and even discover more. Yes. We want to also, now we have compared the plants, the moss and the fern, but I also want us to compare the what? Alternation of generation between these two plants. Is it the same? These life cycles, are they the same? There are some similarities, but there are also some differences. Let's go through them faster. The similarities, spore formation occurs in the spore-bearing sporangia. So the spores are produced from the sporangia in both of them. And then the sporophytes are diploid in all of them, and the gametophytes are haploid. And then we have spores formed by meiosis, whereas gametes are formed by mitosis. That is true. The spores are therefore haploid and gametes are diploid. Sexual and asexual reproduction occurs, as we saw there. Male gametes are motile. You saw the sperms swimming from the antheridia to the chigonia. And then the females are not non-motile. And this happens in many of the other plants and even in animals. It's only the male gametes that are motile, and the female gametes are non-motile. In both, one generation is dominant. You saw that in the moss, the gametophyte generation was dominant. And then in the fern, the sporophyte was dominant. And then the other similarities are also there. Great. The differences between the two, can you try them out? That will be your assignment now. The assignment, the differences between the life cycles of the moss and the fern. So let's look at the significance of alternation of generation. How is it important to the life of the organisms? So to begin with, spores cause rapid multiplication of species. These generations bear spores, and spores are produced in large numbers. Therefore, there will be rapid colonization of habitats easily. And then different habitats of the ecosystem are exploited by the different generations. That is also very true. And then it enables plants to cope with adverse environmental conditions. That is true. It also reduces chances of extinction. Remember, some of these spores can live for so long, waiting for conditions to be available, then they germinate. So at any time they can grow. Gametes are formed by meiosis, which brings about genetic variation, which is true, which is good for hybrid vigor and perpetuation of organisms. Great. So we have looked at Phylum Bryophyta, and I want to first pause from there for a water break, and then we shall come back with the Phylum Pteridophyte.